Okay. Good evening, everybody. There are a few seats down here still, so if you'd like to come down. Yep. Should be on, right? Nope. Is it working now? Now? Okay. So there are some seats down here. If you would like to come down, a couple over here. So welcome, everybody. I'm really pleased to see such a great turnout. I'm Betsy Brewer. I'm the Director of International Education here at the college, and I also work with the Weisberg Program. And the Weisberg Program in Human Rights is sponsoring today's talk, and earlier today sponsored the alumni panel that took place in this room talking about pathways into careers around human rights. So I want to talk a little bit about the Weisberg Program, and then I'm going to introduce Ian Hedges, a Beloit alum, who's going to introduce Tess Borden, who's our speaker tonight. So the Weisberg Program at Beloit College prepares students to engage critically with human rights and to develop effective and responsible strategies that promote and defend human dignity. It does this by providing opportunities for students to gain hands-on experience with human rights work, as well as educational programming. And for those of you who came to this afternoon's panel discussion, you heard a lot about the opportunities that our graduates have taken for study abroad, for internships, volunteering, all sorts of experiential learning that help them apply what they were learning in the classroom to things outside of the classroom in real-world settings, and then allow them to take questions from that real-world work back into the classroom. You're all encouraged to do the same thing. The programming that the Weisberg Program does includes the Weisberg Chair Program, which each year brings a leading human rights advocate to campus for a week-long residency. And this year in March, from March 21 to 28, we're going to be hosting Stephen W. Hawkins as the chair, and Stephen Hawkins is a lawyer and social justice advocate who works on incarceration. So I hope that you will be here for those events. Look forward to announcements about the week, about his week here. So the Weisberg Chair Program is now in its 19th year. We'll celebrate the 20th year next year. And this forum and this lecture are now in the 10th year. And so the forum is the way of kicking off the year and helping the campus think about human rights. To get us started, I just want to talk about a little bit about Ian Hedges for a couple of minutes, who's going to introduce Tess. He's a 2012 graduate of the college. He majored in international relations here at the college, but he also studied abroad in Chile and did some very interesting independent study work there around public health, and then founded the Beloit Public Health Initiative, which is a student organization which many of you know about and are active in, and is still an ongoing endeavor that's been doing great work with the community. And in part because Ian was doing that work and knew people in the community, he was able to come back to Rock County in 2015 to begin working for the Health Net of Rock County as the CEO. And Health Net is a free and charitable clinic based in Janesville. So before joining Health Net, Ian worked in Washington, D.C., and he also worked in, were you still based in D.C. working for them? So he was in D.C. as well, working for the American Psychiatric Association. He's a really interesting case for those of you who are thinking about, what am I going to do after Beloit? He zigged and zagged and zigged and then ended back up here. And that zigging and zagging, but gaining experience that lead you from one place to another and keep teaching you and keep you on course and thinking about, what do I really care about? What do I want to do with my life, and what is going to get me up every day up and excited about going to work? That's been his motivator, and that's what he's doing here now with Health Net. So we're really happy to have him here. So one of the hopes of the Weisberg Program and of the founders of the Weisberg Program, Marvin Weisberg, Nina Weisberg, who graduated from the college, Marvin's her father, was that the Weisberg Program would really create a network, and the network would be amongst faculty, students, alumni, and the guests who come, who contribute knowledge and experience to us by speaking and interacting with all of us. And so Ian is a really great example of that, and we're really grateful both that he continues to host Weisberg, all sorts of students who are thinking about going into public health. He is a really great mentor for students. But he also was very kind and proactive in asking if we could partner around this fall forum, and he brought us Tess Borden. So we're really happy about that. And I'm going to ask Ian to come up and introduce Tess.
Oh, sorry. Thank you. So I want to thank you all for joining us this evening. My name is Ian Hedges, and I do work at HealthNet of Rock County, which is a free and charitable medical, dental, and vision clinic in Janesville. I am a proud Beloit College alumnus, and I am so excited that this topic is here right now because so much of my previous work is grounded in behavioral health and addictions. I'm especially excited for Tess's talk this evening. You know, as we're going through an opiate epidemic locally, I think it's important for us to begin the discussion of how we are breaking up families, how we are tearing community members away from the communities through incarcerating drug users instead of seeking treatment for them. We are now beginning to understand that alternative options to incarcerated really do yield more benefits to society. And I really want to thank Tess so much for her work is inspiring so many people nationally to take that approach as well. I do want to give Tess's bio because it's an impressive one, but Ms. Borden is currently a staff attorney at the New Jersey ACLU. And she, before that, she was the REA Nier Fellow at Human Rights Watch and the American Civil Liberties Union from 2015 to 2017. She worked in the U.S. program focusing on the intersection of drug policy and criminal justice and authored the joint report, which you're hopefully getting a preview tonight of, called Every 25 Seconds, The Human Toll of Criminalizing Drug Use in the United States. Before this, Ms. Borden clerked for the Honorable George A. O'Toole, Jr. of the United States District Court for the District of Massachusetts and was a researcher for the United States Special Rapporteur on Extrajudicial Summary on Arbitrary Executions. She also worked as a summer associate at a large law firm in New York City as a paralegal in an immigration practice in Ithaca, New York, and as an intern with Human Rights Watch in Dakar, and with the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia in The Hague. She received her law degree from Harvard Law School, where she was a member of the International Human Rights Clinic and an editor of the Harvard Human Rights Journal. She came today even while working on a case over the phone. So we are so appreciative that she was able to join us and to provide her insight and research for us this evening. Thank you so much, Tess.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. How'd I do? Yeah, can you hear me? Thank you so much for being here tonight. I'm really thrilled and honored to be joining you. I'm really gratified and humbled by the number of you who turned out. And I'm excited to talk to you, but mostly to hear back from you at the end of this. So I thought, because you now know all about me, we could start by my asking just a little bit about you by a show of hands. And so it looks like we have a good amount of students here, which is fabulous. Can you raise your hand if you're a freshman? Nice. Welcome. Have fun. And sophomores? And juniors? Good junior showing. And seniors? Nice. And non-students, or students of life? Nice. Well, thanks for being here. And how many of you sort of consider yourself social justice advocates or enthusiasts? And how many of you do work in or are interested in doing work in criminal justice? Cool. and human rights. I don't think these are mutually exclusive. Cool. And public health. Nice. Great. And international work. You guys do everything. Great. Do it all. Well, great. I hope that some of what I say can touch on each of those fields. And I'm here to talk about the work I've done and the things I've seen and the things I hope to see. But I hope also in the Q&A to sort of be available to you both, formally in the group setting and afterwards, if I can answer job questions or coursework questions or, what's commuting from Brooklyn to Newark like questions. So I'm here. So as Ian said, I'm a staff attorney at the ACLU of New Jersey as of 10 days ago. Before that, I was a fellow. And I think I'll spend most of this evening talking about my time as a fellow, specifically between 2015 and 2016, when I spent a year doing an investigation into the criminal law and law enforcement approach to personal drug use and drug possession. And so as part of that investigation, I conducted a lot of interviews all over the country. I did 366 interviews. A colleague suggested sort of morbidly that I could make one of those day-by-day calendars with one depressing interview quote for each day. I haven't yet done that, but I do hold those quotes in my heart and in my mind. And of those 366 interviews, about 150 of them were with people who were prosecuted for their drug use and for drug possession. 64 of them I did in jails and prisons, which is an extraordinary experience. And so I want to talk to you about our findings there and about some of the stories and the people I met. And as any almost 32-year-old, I have a lot of friends who are in consulting. And consultants always say you should always say 3 things. But I'm a civil rights lawyer, so I like to push the envelope. So I want to do 5 things tonight in the amount of time we have. I want to talk to you about the report, first and foremost. I want to talk to you about why I think the human rights framework still matters, even today, arguably even more so today. I want to talk to you about things on the horizon, issues and so-called solutions that I think we should all be sort of wary of, even as we move in the right direction on some of these things. Fourthly, I want to talk to you just at the human level, recognizing that I'm here on campus and that I consider myself a lifelong student. So I want to talk to you about some of the things I've learned. And fifthly, I'd love to answer your questions. So that's my plan for the night, and I'll try to walk around so it doesn't get too boring. So every 25 seconds, this report starts off with 2 stories. And you can all find a copy online at aclu.org or hrw.org. And the first story, almost all of these names are pseudonyms. So in all my interviews, I obviously do a really extensive informed consent. And a lot of people gave me permission to use their real names, and I sort of made the executive ethical decision to use pseudonyms anyways, because many of them were still incarcerated or had pending charges, and I wanted to make sure there was no form of reprisal whatsoever. So I'm going to use pseudonyms. So the report starts with a man named Neil Scott. I named Neil Scott. And Neil is a 49-year-old man, black man, living in New Orleans, had been homeless for as long as he could remember, struggled with a rare autoimmune disease that got substantially worse when he was in jail, and self-medicated. And Neil was picked up for a crack pipe, and the crack pipe had 0.02 grams of cocaine inside of it. And so Neil, well, the police who stopped Neil could have asked if he was okay and if he needed help and if he wanted to be brought to a local treatment center. But instead, of course, the police arrested him. The prosecutor in that case decided to charge him with drug paraphernalia, which is a misdemeanor in Louisiana, but also with felony drug possession, which is a felony. And because Neil had so many prior convictions for drug possession, he was facing a mandatory minimum of 20 years in prison in Louisiana State Prison, up to life. Neil's bond was set at $75,000. He's homeless. He didn't have a job. Any money he could get, he spent on his health. He went to the local hospitals when he was in dire condition and needed medical aid. So he didn't have money for a $7,500 bond. So he sat in jail. And he didn't get any of his medications in jail. And he had a fabulous public defender named Alexis, who I became close friends with, and she advocated, and she went through hell and high water to try to get those medicines for him. He never got the medication. She advocated and went through hell and high water to try to get his bond reduced so he could get out and at least go to the local hospital to get the treatment that he needed for his disease. At one point, when they're arguing over this bond amount, Neil actually passed out in the courtroom. And Alexis describes to me his eyes rolled back in his head, and he fell and he hit his head on the defendant's stand, and he started foaming at the mouth and convulsing. And in Louisiana, you're cuffed when you're in courtroom too, because that makes you look really innocent before the judge. So he's cuffed, and he's like flailing, and his eyes are rolled back in his head, and he's foaming at the mouth. And Alexis said, I actually thought he was going to die, and I didn't know what to do. And so the public defender, rolled him over because she had heard in some, emergency medicine class that if someone is going to have a seizure or a stroke, you should make sure that they don't choke on their own vomit. So she rolls them over and says, can we call 911? And the sheriff's officer is there and says, no, he's a warden of the jail, so the jail medical staff has to come. So they wait 20 minutes while he's foaming at the mouth, and the jail staff comes, and they don't know what to do with him. So finally they call 911, and the emergency medical team comes in with oxygen tanks, and they take care of him. He spends the night in the hospital. And the judge still refuses to lower his bond, and the prosecutor still objects to a bond reduction. Point of this story is that there are a lot of players who are complicit in this system. Neil eventually gets out. His ex-wife and children have a fish fry and fundraise for him, so he gets enough money to pay a bail bondsman to get out. And 2 months later comes back to court and pleads guilty to 3 years in prison. And I was in the courtroom the day he pled guilty. He looked really, really sick. He was limping. He could barely hold his head up. He said he couldn't feel his entire left leg or any of his toes. And his attorney got him a month sort of to get his affairs in order before he had to turn himself in for formal sentencing and to be remanded back to the prison. And so I asked Neil if I could take him out to dinner. And so we went out to dinner that first night when he had just pled guilty for 0.02 grams of cocaine to what was essentially a life in prison sentence, because he didn't expect he was going to live through 3 years of no medical care. And he chose, do any of you know New Orleans? Anyone know Frenchman Street? So Bourbon Street is really crazy. Don't go to Bourbon Street, or go to Bourbon Street with a friend and call your mom when you get home safe. Frenchman is where all the music is, and it is amazing, and you should go. And he wanted to meet on Frenchman, and he wanted to meet at Dat Dog, which is a hot dog shop on Frenchman. And so we met at Frenchman, and there was a second line outside, which is the New Orleans tradition of, when someone dies, having like a funeral procession that is jazz music and dancing in the streets, because in New Orleans and Louisiana, like death is a celebration of life too. And so we sat outside and we listened to this second line, and he danced the music even though he couldn't feel his legs. And all I could think this whole time was, this man just said he was guilty for something that shouldn't be an offense at all, and he's going to die in prison. I don't want to start rambling at the start of this talk, because I'm sure I will by the end, but suffice it to say, Neil is in prison. He wrote to me a few months after that, so that August, and told me that he was in a prison where there was no doctor on staff, so he wasn't doing so great. And last time I checked, he's still alive, but he's still not under a doctor's care. And so I tell this story to be a little sobering, because I want to lay the groundwork for this talk of the human lives that are at the core of these conversations. I think it's easy to get really heady and really theoretical and really numbers-driven and data-oriented, and all of that is really important if we're going to change policies. But I think it's really important that we remember that there are human lives at the center of it. I also tell this story because it wasn't just the law that was wrong in Neil's case. It was also all the people who had so much discretion they could have exercised so that it would come out another way. And so that means the police, that means the prosecutor who objected to the bond reduction and sought a felony conviction in this case. That means the judge. That means the prison officials who are there looking over him every day. And I think it's important to remember that it's not just the law that can be wrong, but it's also the enforcement of that law. And so as we talk about theory, we also have to talk about practice. Another story that's in the introduction is a woman I call Nicole. I met Nicole in the Harris County Jail, which is an infamous jail in Houston, Texas. She was about to turn 30. She had 3 kids at home. One of them was a newborn. Her breasts were full of milk still. And she was inside on 2 residue cases also. You can catch a theme here of these tiny, tiny amounts. She was in allegedly for a plastic baggie that had heroin residue on it at 0.01 grams of heroin, and a straw, a plastic like fountain straw that supposedly had turned blue when the police poured something into it, and therefore it supposedly had Coke, though she says she doesn't use Coke. So she was inside. While she was inside, her little girl, whose name is Rose, learned to sit up on her own, and Nicole wasn't there for it. Nicole's husband brought Rose to the jail to visit her, but in Harris County, the jail has glass, so when you have visitation, you can't actually talk to someone unless it's through a phone. So the baby doesn't know how to hold a phone to her ear, so the baby can't hear her mama say, "Congratulations, you're so great." And she spent 4 months inside. And finally, she pled guilty, again, to a felony, though under Texas law, these could have been misdemeanors. In exchange for a guilty plea to the 0.01 grams of heroin in the plastic baggie, the prosecutor decided to drop the straw charge. I think it's kind of funny because it's like a straw man. He dropped the thing that wasn't really there. And she got to go home on probation. But she was a felon now. It's her first conviction, felony conviction. She goes home to her 3 kids as a felon, as a drug offender. Nicole was in school getting a business administration degree, but she was on financial aid, so she doesn't qualify for federal financial aid anymore, so she had to drop out of school. They were renting an apartment, she and her husband, but she's a felon now, and so the landlord didn't want her name on the lease, so they had to leave the place because he knew that she was living there, and she is now a felon, and he doesn't want to rent to a felon. She no longer qualified for the food stamps because in Louisiana, each state is different. In Louisiana, you don't qualify for food stamps anymore for a year after your felony conviction, and she had been relying on them to feed herself and her young kids. And when I talked to Nicole afterwards, she said, supposedly I, have served my time. This is my punishment. But the reality is, with all of these things, I'm going to be punished for the rest of my life. So I tell that story because I think it shows that, we talk a lot about mass incarceration and really long sentences. Nicole didn't spend that long inside, but she ended up being punished for forever long afterwards. And I think it's important as we think about criminalization, and I say, mass criminalization even more than mass incarceration, to think about the knock-on effects and the, collateral consequences, both formal, statutory, and informal, for an individual and for the individual's family that really do follow them for the rest of their lives, like a shadow, or even more so, I'm going to fail on this metaphor, but like if the shadow is behind you, the gate, the bar in front of you that prevents you from doing what you want to do. So those are 2 of the 60 stories in the report of the 150 stories in my brain. And I think it's important to sort of keep those at the forefront of our minds. So let me go to point 1 now, after all of that. And those are, that is briefly to talk about the main findings from this report. And what I want to talk about is basically the scale of the enforcement of drug possession laws, which we found through a really extensive data analysis is absolutely massive. The second thing I want to touch on is the way policing happens, especially around drug laws, and the racial discrimination that's involved therein. The third that I've hinted at already is the really aggressive prosecution of drug possession laws, often for really tiny amounts. The fourth is the collateral consequences and knock-on effects of the arrest and conviction, whether for a misdemeanor or a felony. I'm going to tell you briefly about how I think this totally fails on public health terms, and then talk to you about our recommendations. So that's point one. So briefly, the scale of enforcement. So as part of my research, I did massive data requests and public records or FOIA requests. And so we got some really exciting data, both from the FBI at the national level, as well as from specific states that allowed us to look deeply or in depth at what was happening in particular jurisdictions. And so at the national level, what we found is the scale of enforcement is totally out of control. All states criminalize the possession of illicit drugs. Some states, as you all know, have decriminalized or even legalized marijuana, but every single state criminalizes the simple possession of all the other illicit drugs. In 42 of those states, it can be prosecuted as a felony offense. And what we see is that law enforcement is really taking that permission and running with it. So this report is titled Every 25 Seconds because every 25 seconds someone is arrested in the US simply for possessing drugs. And again, that's drugs for their personal use. This is not like grand cartels. This is just using drugs, doing something to my own body. Those every 25 seconds, every single hour, every single day translates into about 1.25 million arrests for drug possession every year. And that makes drug possession the single most arrested crime in the US, which frankly was pretty shocking to me because when I think about law enforcement, when you think about Law and Order or CSI, you don't think about people who are using drugs. But actually, that is the #1 arrest offense in our country. What we also found, the data shows, is that this, because it's #1, it means it's totally out of proportion with everything else that law enforcement may say is enforcement priorities, right? So when we think about sort of drug law enforcement is often talking about whether it be cartels or big gangs or dealing. We know that one person is arrested for drug dealing for every 4 people who are arrested for drug possession. We also know that half of those 1.2 million arrests for drug possession are just for marijuana, are just for marijuana. And that means that each year there are more people arrested for marijuana possession than there are for all violent crimes combined. And this is the FBI's own numbers that show this. So again, I think, think about sort of the narrative that you're told about public safety priorities and concerns. We're making more arrests for marijuana at the state level than we are for all violent crimes combined. I think that's really extraordinary. As a result of these arrests, not surprisingly, a lot of people are incarcerated. And so at any given point, there are 137,000 people behind bars just because they were convicted of drug possession. That's about 89,000 of those 137 are in local jails. And the vast majority of that, 89,000, are there pre-trial, meaning they haven't yet actually been convicted. They're still presumed innocent under the law. Many of them are being detained simply because they can't afford their bail. And that number is obviously an undercount because that's, like a snapshot of a jail and prison population. And what we know is each day, tens of thousands more are cycling through jails and prisons, are getting convicted, are spending extensive periods of time on probation and parole, are struggling with court-imposed fines and fees, are being locked out of various jobs and housing and employment opportunities and education opportunities. And so that 139,000 is really an undercount by any stretch of the imagination. I want to talk about racial discrimination. Over their lifetimes, white and black people use drugs at about equivalent rates. In fact, white people over their lifetime use drugs a little bit more than black people. And I would like to talk about Latinos and various other populations, but the data we got from the FBI doesn't count Latino as a race. And so Latinos are usually considered white people, or if they look really dark, maybe the police calls them a black person. But we only have black and white numbers to work with, which I flag as a real problem. And so I think for those of you interested in quant and data, making sure the data sets are defined in social justice terms, or at least in inclusive terms or factually correct terms is really important. Anyways, let's say white and black people use drugs at about the same rates. Despite this, around the country, a black person is about 2.5 times more likely to be arrested for drug possession than a white person. And again, that's despite equivalent rates of use. In many states, that number is significantly higher. It's over 6-to-1 in Montana, Iowa, and Vermont. Where I'm from, it's 11-to-1 in Manhattan. I looked it up for Wisconsin, and it's 4-to-1 for all drug possession here. That 4-to-1 ratio is the same nationally for the marijuana arrest rate. So it's 2.5-to-1 black to white for all drugs combined. When you look at just marijuana arrests, it's 4-to-1 black and white. So I think that's interesting and problematic. I think it's also interesting that we see disparities within jurisdictions, right? So you might say, well, state law is different, so is it really meaningful to compare Wisconsin to New York? But when you look within individual states, where again, rates of drug use are about the same across state, you see different jurisdictions under different police forces arresting with different disparities also. And I think that's really interesting because those law enforcement officers are operating under the same laws, but they're choosing to selectively enforce in different ways. So I think, again, that sort of drives home my theme of the laws can be wrong, but we can also look at the way the laws are enforced and do advocacy around that enforcement as well. I want to tell you a quick story about the impact of these arrests, because I think we think a lot about a standing prison or jail population, what it means to literally physically be behind bars, or what it means to have a felony or even a misdemeanor conviction. Even just the criminal record of an arrest can be, and that experience can be really devastating. So I met a man in Jefferson Parish, Louisiana, who I called Darius Mitchell. And Darius was about my age, so early 30s at the time. He had a kid who was 6, and he wasn't married to his kid's mom, but they parented really well together. And he had picked the kid up from mom's house and was driving home late one night, and he was pulled over by the cops. And the cops came up to his window, and he rolled it down. Or he probably didn't roll it down. He probably pressed it down. That felt like more dramatic. He pressed his window down, and the cop said, "You're speeding." And Darius Mitchell is a big black man, and he was like, "I wasn't speeding, right? Like, we know what's going on." "I wasn't speeding, officer." And he says, "Well, then I smell marijuana." Like, "Well, I'm not smoking marijuana." And so he calls for backup. Another cop comes. Meanwhile, the 6-year-old is in the back seat this whole time, sleepy. And the other cop comes, and the cop pulls the door open and yells, "Where are the pounds?" Like, he's a big drug dealer. And Darius is like, "I don't have any pot." In Louisiana, marijuana is criminalized, as it is in most states in this country. And in jurisdictions where marijuana is illegal, the smell of marijuana gives an officer reasonable suspicion or probable cause either to stop you or, if you're in the car, to search you. So quick Fourth Amendment lesson, you have a right under our Constitution to be free from illegal searches and seizures. If a cop pulls you over, he can't just go into your car, or she, go into your car and open your glove compartment. But if they have probable cause to believe that some crime has been or is being committed, they can search different parts of your vehicles depending on the scope of that probable cause. I'm a lawyer. Brief legal lesson. So in the states where marijuana is illegal, that if an officer smells the marijuana, that gives you probable cause to search anywhere marijuana could be found, which is like anywhere you could put pot in your car. So the officer says he smells marijuana, and that clearly Darius is a big drug dealer, and so he tells Darius to get out of the car, tells Darius to take the kid out of his car, and proceeds to search anywhere that marijuana could be found. He opens the glove compartment. He finds a bottle with like the prescription, the thing with the name and the address and everything on it that you get from CVS, for the kid's mom for hydrocodone. Darius is arrested on the spot for felony possession of pills without a prescription. And he's like, "I can call the mom. Like, she has a prescription from this." He had just driven her the week before to the ER because she was injured or something. She had been prescribed hydrocodone. She didn't like the idea of taking pain pills, and she had forgotten it in his glove compartment. The officers don't let her, it's the middle of the night. The officers don't let him make the call. Don't call a pharmacy because it's the middle of the night. He gets arrested. He spends the night in jail. They never find any pot. He bonds out the next day. He hires a lawyer. Luckily, he can afford to hire one. And not surprisingly, he beats the charge, right? Like, she has a prescription for the hydrocodone. He is not a felon for having the hydrocodone. So he gets acquitted. So, like, great end of the story, right? He spent $5,000 on the lawyer. He lost his job because he had to take so much time to go to the courthouse to beat this charge. His kid is seriously traumatized because he saw the cops screaming at his dad and calling him a drug dealer. And he still has a record of the arrest. He still has something on his record when you run his name that says he was arrested for felony drug possession. And so I tell this story just to say, even when it doesn't go all the way and they don't spend 20 years inside, just the fact of being able to arrest someone for drug possession, and then the way in practice that sometimes that happens, often, I would argue, on racial lines, is highly, highly problematic. Prosecutions. So again, with this theme of, and I don't mean to say like all cops are bad cops or all prosecutors are bad prosecutors. I've met a lot of good in a lot of different walks of life. I think there is a culture sometimes of being really tough on crime, especially when you have law enforcement leaders who are elected. And so I want to sort of like caveat all this with the point that I'm not trying to vilify prosecutors and cops. I'm saying I think there's a lot of discretion, and sometimes that discretion is used, in my mind, really unjustly. So what we found both through the data and through all these stories is that, you know, with these laws on the books, we're not only seeing the extraordinary scale of arrest, we're also seeing really, really aggressive prosecution. We're seeing where the state gives prosecutors the discretion to prosecute as felony drug possession or misdemeanor drug paraphernalia. We're always seeing often seeing the highest charge being chosen. We're seeing felony prosecutions brought for tiny, tiny amounts of drugs in what I think is a real waste of human resources. And so I want to pull out briefly just the Texas data because I think it's really fascinating. So I got data from a lot of different states, and this data set came from the Texas court system. And Texas law defines different sort of degrees of felony based on the amount of drugs you have across the board for drugs. So it's not, even though, you know, a hit of cocaine versus heroin, like, is a different amount. They treat, or a dosage is a different amount. They sort of like treat any weight of illicit drugs as the same. But because they do it by weight, the data we got from the court allowed us to look at exactly what kinds of amounts, what kind of use was being prosecuted. And I think to push back against that narrative that, you know, well, we're letting them plead to drug possession, but these are really dealers. So in Texas, they created this offense that's called a state jail felony, and I won't bother you with the whole history of the state jail system in Texas. It's a really unhappy one. But jails, as those of you who do criminal justice work may know, are usually run by the sheriff or other local entity. It's a county jail, whereas a prison is a state prison. It's a state Department of Corrections. And Texas sort of made this hybrid Venn diagram called a state jail, which is run by the state, but was supposed to be for people who were sort of your frequent flyers, as they called them, those coming in and out of the system, with the idea of, you know, if you're only going to stay for 6 months or up to 2 years, we want to get you kind of in and out and rehabilitated. Not surprisingly, the funds for the rehabilitation never came through, so these jails, state jails, are really awful. There's no air conditioning. They're like, it's where the worst medical care or lack thereof is. But anyways, we have this state jail felony offense now. And for drug possession, under 1 gram is considered a state jail felony. So it's a felony conviction still, but it's the lowest sort of amount that you can possibly have. And what our data analysis showed was that 80% of people who were sentenced to some period of incarceration in Texas for drugs were for state jail. So that means 80% of people being sentenced to serve time, going into the incarceratory system, possessed under a gram of drugs. And what we found, and I should say a gram, like I'm no expert, and actually I met a lot of people who made a lot of fun of me because I don't actually know what I'm talking about when it comes to a lot of these drugs, and so they'd have to like draw diagrams of how the pipe worked and everything. I'd be like, let me explain to you. But from my understanding, for a new user, a gram is like a handful of doses of most of the drugs we're talking about. For people who have developed tolerance, it's many fewer. And what I found through my interviews was that most of these people prosecuted for state jail felony drug possession were not charged with 0.9 or 0.8 grams. They were charged with like 0.2 grams or 0.02 or 0.007 or in a lot of cases, trace. So in Texas, these drugs are usually tested before the person is actually allowed to plead guilty or in the rare case goes to trial. And in so many of these cases, the lab technician was just writing trace because he or she literally could not assign a weight to it because it was such a tiny amount of residue in that crack pipe or in that baggie or what have you that you literally could not weigh the thing without the bag. So it was just trace, and they were still getting felony convictions. There was one case of a woman named Deborah who was prosecuted on a felony charge for 0.0052 grams of cocaine. That's in a lab where the error is 0.0038 grams, which means, if you can do the math in your head or pull out your phones, that it could have been as little as 0.0014 grams. And to put that into perspective, a sugar packet that you get at do you have cafeterias, dining halls? At the dining hall is 4 grams. Right, so 1 gram is a fourth of a sugar packet. So 0.0014 grams would be 3,500 thousandths of a gram. Like, I don't even know what that means. Right, and why is that a felony? Why is any of this a felony? Why is any of this a misdemeanor? I don't really know, but that is extraordinary to me. And I think that, I would argue, is a gross abuse of discretion. I talked to a man in a Dallas jail, a 66-year-old man named Bill Moore who was serving a 3-year prison sentence for 0.0202 grams of meth. Hector Ruiz, who the prosecutor made an offer of 6 years to for an empty bag with heroin that weighed 0.007 grams. Matthew Russell in Granbury, Texas, was ultimately convicted by a jury of having a trace amount of heroin, and that jury sentenced him to 15 years in prison for a lab report that said trace on it. What's all this mean for people's lives? It means a lot for the individual. It means, although, as I said, we have marijuana reform, every state continues to criminalize the possession of illicit drugs, and that, whether at a misdemeanor or a felony level, stays on your record usually forever. You can look this up, but there are literally tens of thousands of collateral consequences by statute, both federally and state, for a conviction. There are a lot of collateral consequences that attach solely to drug-related convictions because, I don't know, drugs are worse. We see implications for, as I've said, federal financial aid and often state financial aid. We see implications for licensures. It's really hard to get a professional license if you have a conviction, and some professional license boards make a distinction for drugs, again, specifically. I've talked about food stamps. We see people denied food stamps because of drug convictions. We see in the private sphere, although it's not like a formal collateral consequence, we see private landlords, private employers denying, am I echoing? Denying people housing. Housing also. Public housing you can't go into if you have a drug conviction. How am I doing? Not me, the lights. We see people not being able to get into housing, whether it's public because they're formally barred by statute or whether it's private and the landlord just doesn't want to rent to you. Every single rental application I've always had to fill out has a box to check. That's not true. The ACLU doesn't do it. But almost every single employer application I've had to fill out also has a check. And so there's a huge movement to ban the box, both at the local and state levels. Obama tried to institute a federal ban the box as well, which I think is a step in the right direction, though it doesn't go all the way. We see it in the criminal court context also. If you have a prior conviction, even sometimes a prior arrest, that can be used against you either formally as like a sentencing enhancement, so you are sort of like formally considered to be more culpable because of that prior, or just in the judge's discretion. It's something at the federal and state levels that judges are allowed to take into account when they sentence defendants. And probably most extraordinarily in my mind, we see it in the family context. We know that incarceration pays the heaviest toll on the people who are left behind. I met a lot of kids, adult kids and little kids whose parents were locked up, or kids who were suffering like Nicole's kids eventually did because their parents came home, but they were still saddled with that criminal record. So I want to tell a really quick story about Corey Ladd, who is one of 2 real names I'll use tonight, so you can Google him, but don't Google him yet because it'll spoil it. Corey Ladd was arrested in New Orleans. He is a really good guy. The police and the prosecutor never really had to prove the facts of the marijuana because it wasn't disputed, but Corey's story at least is that he was in a car with his 2 friends who were dating. The driver was the guy. The passenger was 7 months pregnant. And there was a baggie of pot in the car. It was half an ounce. So it's like pot, it's not residue, but it's also like you can't roll that many joints with it, right? It's not that much pot. But they were going to share it. Like, he's young 20s, that's an okay thing to do, I think. And the cops flashed their lights and pulled him over. I can't remember whether it was a broken tail light, allegedly, or a failure to use the turn signal. It's amazing, just as a side note, like the number of ways in which a cop is allowed to pull you over. And again, I'm not vilifying cops. I'm saying, like, statutorily, it is incredible. In the states I visited, like jaywalking, and then like query who's actually stopped for jaywalking. Black and brown people. Jaywalking, walking. My favorite, because I grew up in the country, was walking on the side of the road that if there's no sidewalk provided, I guess you're required in many states to walk on the side of the road that the traffic is coming in, so like the same direction as traffic, which for me, growing up in the country, is like so dangerous because you're supposed to walk on the opposite side so you know if the car is coming and you can run out of the way. But anyways, people I met were pulled over because there was no sidewalk and they were walking against traffic instead of with traffic, which is bogus to me. Failure to use your turn signal, though I'm pretty sure every driver in New York State doesn't use their turn signal. All kinds of things, right? So they get pulled over for something. And Corey takes the Ziploc bag and puts it in his waistband because, like, his other friend doesn't have any convictions and he doesn't want him to get his first conviction, and the lady's 7 months pregnant. So he, according to him, puts it in his waist pocket. The rest is undisputed. So he has half an ounce of pot that's found on him. Why he ends up being searched, I actually don't know, but it's not surprising that when someone is pulled over, they're ultimately searched. I should add that Corey is a white man, as you imagine people, and I actually think that that's significant. We know that the racial disparities are extraordinary and that black and brown people are disproportionately impacted, but it happens to white people too. So Corey has 2 priors. For LSD possession when he was 18 and hydrocodone possession when he was, I think, 21. He got probation both times, so this is not someone who's ever spent any time, significant time behind bars, and he has prior marijuana possession convictions. So that's his whole record, just drugs. So he gets charged because, oh my gosh, I'm slipping. I used to know all these statutory schemes really well. He was facing 13 1/3 to 40. And don't ask me to do that math for you. In Louisiana, it's you like take the statutory range and you multiply it by 2/3 if it's this number and by 1/3 if it's that number. His range is 13 1/3, meaning if he's convicted at trial, the minimum he will get The minimum is 13 1/3 years in prison. The maximum the judge could give him is 40. And so that's a sentencing scheme for those of you studying criminal justice that's called mandatory minima or mandatory minimums, which I'm highly opposed to. It takes discretion away from the judge and essentially leaves it to the prosecutor to decide what the appropriate penalty is. I just looked at the clock, so I'm going to talk a little faster. So that's his range. The prosecutor offers him 10 years in prison. And, the pot's on Corey, but he's like, maybe I'll get jury nullification, right? Maybe the jury will think, this is crazy that you're trying to send someone to prison for pot. So he takes it to trial. He loses. The judge sentenced him to 20 years. I met Corey in prison. He had been in for 4.5 years at the time. His girlfriend at the time, who's now no longer in his daughter's life and wasn't really after she gave birth, was 8 months pregnant when he went inside. So Corey had never seen his daughter when I met him outside of prison. He had seen her for the first time in the courtroom, like at the back of the room, and he hadn't been allowed to reach over. There's a bar in a courtroom. And actually, as a side note, when you're admitted to the bar, like you become a lawyer and are admitted, it comes from this idea that you get to walk through the bar. But he was on the wrong side of the bar, and the sheriff's officer didn't let him reach over and touch his little girl. So he first saw her in the courtroom. He first held her in Angola prison. For those of you who do criminal justice work, you'll know Angola is notoriously, infamously horrible as a prison. And so I met him at 4.5 years in. He had never seen his little girl outside of prison. She thought she was being raised by his parents, who are wonderful, and she thought that she was visiting him at work when they came to prison, because they'd meet in this big room, and she thought it was a restaurant where Daddy worked. And he told me, by the time I'm out, she's going to be, at this point, long story, he had been resentenced to 17 years. So he told me, she's going to be 17 by the time I'm home, and by then she'll know that this place is not where I work. So I say that to say, the consequences are not just for Corey, but they're also for Charlie, his little girl, for his parents, for his brother who died when Corey was inside, and Corey wasn't allowed to go to his brother's funeral. So they're really extensive. Okay, I'm going to try to talk faster. Quickly, the failures of public health. I think, it's been 45 years since the war on drugs was declared. I don't think any of us can pretend that the war on drugs was a success. I think we see that when we look at the data, rates of drug use certainly haven't gone down. And when we look at opioids in particular, obviously they've spiked at alarming and tragic and fatal rates. So I don't think any of us can pretend that this has worked. We also know that criminalizing personal drug use actually drives it underground, and this has been studied not only in the US, but all around the world. We know people are scared of calling for help. We know people aren't getting the treatment they need. I'm not going to tell you the story of Byron Augustine, which is also his real name, but you can read about it in the report. He was sentenced to 20 years because he called 911 when his friend overdosed on heroin, and Byron was charged with the heroin that his friend dosed on. So he saved his friend's life, and he got 20 years in prison. There are a lot of other ways of doing it, and I'm not going to talk about those either because I'm talking too long. But just briefly to say, Portugal decriminalized all personal drug use in 2001. It was up to a 10-day, or is up to a 10-day supply of drugs. And they took all the cost savings from no longer having to police and prosecute and convict or judge and incarcerate, and instead invested that into treatment and public education campaigns. And the early social science results from that are really promising. Overdose deaths are way down. Adolescent use is down. Adult use is still super low. So I think it behooves us to look at Portugal and some other international experiences. I'll just say really briefly that I think marijuana reform around the country is clearly not opioid decriminalization, but I think it gives us an example of sort of how to implement it at the state level and in the US, which is arguably very different from Portugal. And then there are other local programs that are worth keeping an eye on. Local programs like supervised injection facilities that they have in Vancouver called Insight, for those of you who are doing public health work. The sort of evaluation of Insight's success is really heartwarming. In my hometown of Ithaca, they're pushing for a supervised injection facility, which would be the United States' first one. There are other programs like sort of de facto decriminalization led by local law enforcement, like in Gloucester, Massachusetts. In a number of different cities, there are what are called LEAD programs, law enforcement assisted diversion, where the police, instead of arresting you, can instead bring you to get some sort of treatment and social services plan that was started initially in Seattle and has moved to various other states since then. So I think there are other places to look. Our number one recommendation is to decriminalize. And that's a recommendation, obviously, to state legislators and the US Congress. We also don't think that's an excuse for all the other actors in the system not to do anything. And so at the back of this report, there are 8 pages of recommendations to every level of government, from the local police up through the probation officer and the sentencing judge and the local city council and health and human services and DOJ, et cetera. I did a really bad job time managing, guys. So I got through point 1, which is why the consultants say to say 3 things only and not 5. I'm going to take 3 more minutes and do 1 each. So I promised you to talk about why the human rights framework mattered. And I won't give you the legal lesson. I think there is a legal analysis in this thing about why criminalizing personal drug use violates human rights norms. What I think is more interesting, though don't tell my law professors, is what the methodology and the rights framework when we talk and when we advocate does. Because I think in civil rights law more generally, we don't have the sort of in-depth stories that I think the human rights methodology allows us to find and to elevate. And I think whether you're talking to a local legislator or whether you're talking just to a citizen who's going to the voting booth, I think it's really important. I hope it was for you all to hear the human beings who are at the center of all of this. And in as much as the human rights documentation methodology is grounded in that story finding, I think it's really important. I also think the human rights law and framework allows us to say things that the Bill of Rights or constitutional law discourse doesn't. For instance, I can call the enforcement of drug possession racial discrimination under human rights law. Technically, it's not racial discrimination under constitutional law because of the way the case law is. But I think being able to use those terms is really important. That's why human rights matters, and you should keep doing it. Looking ahead, I just want to flag for all of you who are doing criminal justice work and mass incarceration work, and I know, this spring you have Stephen Hawkins, which will be really exciting, and he does a lot of mass incarceration work, and I think is fabulous, and you should learn from him. I do think mass incarceration or decarceration has become the sexy, exciting, bipartisan issue of our time, and I am grateful for that. I think it is really exciting that the most conservative newspaper in Texas ran a story about my report. I think that's great. I think there are a couple of things that we should be careful for as we talk about decarceration. The first is, let's be really honest about drug possession. If you decriminalize, it's not going to decarcerate. There are 2.3 million people behind bars on any given day in the United States, and I encourage you all, if you haven't looked at it before, to Google the whole mass incarceration, the whole pie, I think it is. It's put out by the Prison Policy Initiative, and it's I have it on my wall at work. It's really depressing, but it shows you the breakdown of who's inside and for what and where. And what that shows us is, first, that most of incarceration is happening at the state level. And while I adore Bernie Sanders and think it's great that he said we're going to become, the number 2 world's incarcerator and not number 1, if you let out every single federal prisoner in the United States, we would still be world's number 1 incarcerator. And what that says is, unfortunately, there is no federal bill that's going to fix all this. We have to do work at the state level. That whole pie also shows us that about 6% of people incarcerated are there just for drug possession. And so that's not going to decarcerate either. And so while I welcome the work, and I think we need to continue it around drug decriminalization, I want to be honest about what it actually means to empty our jails and prisons. And I think that's a much bigger task that we all need to take on. And it means tackling some of the harder things like violent crime and sentencing and parole. I would watch out for drug courts. I think some of them come from a really good place. I take real issue with any kind of coercive treatment. And I think a lot of your colleagues and classmates and alums who do public health work are really the experts here. But there is a move in this sort of decarceration movement to latch on to anything that isn't behind